Hello and welcome to my channel. Sit back, close your eyes, and let yourself be drawn into the story. Imagine it, and drift off to sleep in peace. First of all, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Please leave a comment letting me know what you're watching from a History's most Abbott's Guessing Habits Chapter 1, an appetite for the grossly. Introduction. Food is the most intimate act of human existence. Every culture, in every corner of the world, across every age of recorded history, has organized itself around the question of what to eat. Food defines identity, marks celebration, signals power, expresses devotion, and sustains life. It is the first thing we think about when we wake, and the last comfort we seek before sleep. And yet, across the vast sweep of human history, what people have chosen to eat, how they have prepared it, and the contexts in which they have consumed it can strike the modern observer as not merely unfamiliar, but profoundly, viscerally disturbing. This is not a story about the exotic cuisines of distant cultures as through the lens of misunderstanding. It is not a catalog of things that seem strange only because they are unfamiliar. The history we are about to explore contains genuine extremes, eating practices driven by aspiration, by ideology, by superstition, by medical theory, so mistaken it borders on horror, by the pursuit of pleasure taken to grotesque excess, and conditions of poverty and survival so stark that question of disgust, almost meaningless beside the question of survival. What qualifies as disgusting is, of course, partly cultural. The medieval European who ate rotten meat flavored with expense spices to mask the decay might have found modern processed food horrifying. The ancient Roman who consumed fish sauce made from decomposed fish entrails thought it the height of sophisticated taste. The Victorian doctor who prescribed patients the drinking of fresh blood from slaughterhouse animals believed he was offering them life-saving medicine. Context transforms everything. And yet there are certain eating practices that, when examined closely and in their full historical detail, produce a reaction that transcends cultural relativity and touches something more fundamental in the human gut. We will travel through time and across civilizations, from the banquets of ancient Rome to the survival diets of besieged medieval cities, from the medical eating prescriptions of the early modern period to the famine foods of the 19th and 20th centuries, from the ritualized consumption practices of ancient religions to the grotesque excess of early modern aristocratic tables. We will look honestly and without flinching what people have eaten, why they ate it, and what it tells us about the extraordinary lengths to which human beings will go, whether in desperation or in celebration, to fill the fundamental need that food represents. Chapter 2, The Rotting Table. Ancient Rome's most extreme culinary excesses. Rome, at the height of its imperial power, was a civilization breathtaking contradictions. It built roads that lasted 2,000 years and aqueducts that still carry water today. It produced philosophy, law, engineering, and literature of enduring brilliance. It also produced, among its wealthiest citizens, a culture of eating so extreme in its excess, so deliberately transgressive of ordinary limits, that accounts of Roman elite dining read less like historical record and more like the fevered dreams of a civilization determined to prove that nothing was beyond its reach, not even the most extreme boundaries of the consumable. The garum The Roman poured over virtually everything they ate was, by any modern food safety standard, a substance of considerable horror, made by layering fish, whole fish, including entrails, with salt in large clay vessels, and leaving the mixture to ferment, liquefy, and slowly decompose in the Mediterranean sun for months. Garum was the all-purpose condiment of the Roman world. High-quality garum, made from mackerel or tuna, could be extraordinarily expensive. The manufacture process produced odors so powerful that factories were legally required to be located outside city walls. The fish sauce of Southeast Asia that modern diners encounter in Thai or Vietnamese cooking is distinct if relative of garum, but ancient accounts suggest the Roman product was more intense, by several orders of magnitude, darker, stronger, more thoroughly fermented, with the consistency and pungency of something that had unique the boundary between food and decomposition. The Roman elite had a particular obsession with the costly and the bizarre, and no ingredient combined both qualities more dramatically than silphium. A plant from the North African coast near Cyrene that was so aggressively harvested for its uses in cooking and medicine that it was driven to complete extinction, probably by the 1st century of the Common Era. Silphium's flavor was described by Roman writers as simultaneously pungent, bitter, and intoxicating, something between Anas afoetida and the most powerful garlic imaginable. Its juice was considered an essential flavoring for nearly everything. Its stalks were eaten raw, its root was consumed in quantities that struck even ancient observers as excessive. But it is in the arena of luxury protein that Roman elite eating becomes most genuinely disturbing by modern standards. Dormice, the small European rodents, were considered a significant delicacy and were raised in specially designed enclosures called gluraria, where they were fattened on nuts and acorns before being harvested, stuffed with minced pork and dormouse meat, basted with garum and honey and roasted. The gastrophile Apicius, whose cookbook is the only surviving detailed record of elite Roman cuisine, includes multiple dormouse preparations. These were not poverty foods. They were expensive luxury items served at the tables of the rich. The gastronomic performances of the wealthiest Romans went furthest. Flamingo tongue was considered a delicacy worth the extraordinary expense and effort required to obtain it. The birds were killed solely for the tongue, the rest of the carcass discarded. Peacock brains were served the most extravagant banquets. Sow's womb, harvested immediately after the sow had given birth, or had been induced to miscarry, the so-called vulva iactitio, was considered among the finest available and commanded price that reflected its scarcity and particular conditions of its harvesting. The Roman feast as it existed among the very wealthy, the convivium, was designed to continue for hours, and the volume of food consumed required management strategies that strike modern readers with particular force. The Roman practice of induced vomiting during extended feasts to create space for continued eating is so commonly reported in ancient sources and so frequently repeated in popular history that it has acquired a life somewhat larger than its actual historical prevalence. The ancient sources do describe the practice. The satirist Seneca condemned it. The historian Suetonius described the emperor Vitellius consuming food and then vomiting in order to eat again. Whether it was as widespread as popular imagination suggests or more limited to specific context and personalities is debated historians. But the practice is documented and the moral discussed it provoked even among ancient Romans themselves suggests that even by the standards of an era accustomed to extremes, deliberate purging for the purpose of continued consumption crossed a line that many recognized. The Emperor Vitellius, who ruled Rome for 8 months in 69 CE before being deposed and killed, deserves particular mention in any account of extreme Roman eating. Ancient sources, admittedly hostile ones, describe his meals as occurring 4 times daily and involving quantities of food so enormous that he had to travel between banquets hosted by different associates simply to consume enough. His most famous creation, the dish he named Shield of Minerva, allegedly combined flamingo tongues, pike livers, pheasant and peacock brains, and lamprey roe gathered from across the empire from Spain to the Parthian frontier. Whether this dish was as described or somewhat embellished by hostile writers, the account captures something real about the culture of competitive excess in which the Deliate, a world in which the demonstration of wealth through consumption had been taken to a point where the food itself had become almost secondary to the performance of having obtained it. Chapter 3, Blood, Bile, and Belief. The belief, medical eating in the ancient and medieval world. Those, for most of human history, the boundary between food and medicine was either non-existent or extremely permeable. What you ate was understood to affect not merely your immediate hunger, but your long-term health, your temperament, your spiritual condition, and your relationship with the cosmos. Medical eating, the consumption of specific substances for their supposed therapeutic properties, produced some of the most disturbing eating prescriptions in the historical record, consumed not in desperation, but in the sincere belief that they were beneficial, even life-saving. The humoral theory of medicine, developed by the ancient Greeks and transmitted through Arabic scholarship into medieval and early modern European medicine, held that the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health consisted in the proper of these fluids. Disease represented an imbalance, and treatment involved restoring equilibrium, typically through diet, purging, bloodletting, or the consumption of substances believed to counteract the excess of whatever humor was causing trouble. This framework shaped what sick people were told to eat for roughly 2,000 years, and its dietary prescriptions could be extraordinary. Fresh, human blood was recommended by physicians in various periods as a treatment for epilepsy. The Roman physician Pliny the Elder, whose natural history is one of the most comprehensive surviving records of ancient medical and natural knowledge, described epileptics drinking the blood of slain gladiators as a cure. This practice appears to have been genuine and not merely anecdotal. Epileptics were documented waiting at the arena, cups cupped to collect fresh blood from the bodies of killed fighters, consuming it while it was still warm. The logic within the humoro framework was internally consistent. Gladiators were the strongest and most vital of men, and their blood therefore contained vital qualities, could counteract the weakness or imbalance that caused seizures. The fact that it did not work did not immediately undermine the theory, because medicine had no controlled trials and improvement or deterioration could always be attributed to other factors. Mummy, the desiccated flesh and other tissues of ancient Egyptian mummies, was, from the medieval period through the 17th century, one of the most widely substances in grouping pharmacopoeia, held mummy, mixed into drinks or a plaster, was believed to treat a wide range of conditions, including bruising, hemorrhage, epilepsy, and ulcers. The demand was so significant that it supported an active trade in genuine Egyptian mummies. And when genuine mummies became scarce, merchants supplied the market with counterfeit product. Recently deceased bodies preserved and treated to resemble ancient mummies. Francis I of France, one of the most powerful monarchs of the 16th century, reportedly carried powdered mummy mixed with rhubarb as a personal remedy for injuries sustained in the hunt. The 16th and 17th century physician Paracelsus developed the doctrine of signatures, the idea that natural substances indicated their medical uses through their appearance, and that like cured like. This framework led to recommendations that read from a modern perspective as a kind of culinary surrealism. Yellow substances treated liver complaints. Red substances treated blood disorders. Skull moss, a lichen that grew on human skulls exposed in public places, was prescribed for nosebleeds and epilepsy. Human fat, rendered from executed criminals by a process that required collaboration with executioners and apothecaries, was applied as a salve for joint pain and sold in pharmacies across Europe. The philosopher's stone, in its medical applications, was sometimes described as a substance to be consumed, and the search for it drove alchemists to experiment with extraordinarily dangerous and sometimes lethal preparations. Urine therapy, the consumption of one's own urine for therapeutic purposes, has a history stretching across cultures and millennia that is longer and more mainstream than modern sensibilities generally acknowledge. The ancient Indian Ayurvedic tradition included urine therapy among its treatments. Medieval European physicians recommended urine for various conditions, including skin diseases. The alchemical tradition included extensive experimentation with urine, which was a useful chemical hemagent, and was the source from which phosphorus was first isolated in 1669 by the German alchemist Henigbrand, who processed enormous quantities of human urine in the attempt to distill the philosopher's stone. Drinking one's own urine continued to be advocated by various medical authorities well into the early modern period, and occasional revivals of urine therapy continue to appear in alternative medicine contexts to the present day. The consumption of human remains in a medical context, a practice historians sometimes call medicinal cannibalism, was sufficiently mainstream in early modern Europe that it appears in the pharmacopoeias of multiple countries and in the practice of qualified physicians. Thomas Willis, the 17th century physician who gave his name to the circle of Willis in the brain's blood supply, recommended a preparation made from human skull for the treatment of epilepsy. Human blood, human fat, human bone, and preparations made from mummies appeared in major medical texts, published as late as the 18th century. The modern assumption cannibalism was always and everywhere understood as taboo and outside the boundaries of civilized behavior is complicated considerably by the evidence that, for several centuries, educated European physicians prescribed and patients willingly consumed the processed remains of other human beings, understood not as cannibalism, but as medicine. Chapter 4. The Siege Tableau. Aim to survive in history's great famines and sieges when ordinary food disappears. Through siege, drought, flood, war, or the failures of the political and economic systems that normally keep populations fed, the range of what human beings will eat expands far, beyond anything that would be considered in times of plenty. The history of famine eating is a history of extraordinary resourcefulness and extraordinary suffering, of the progressive consumption of every edible substance available, until that category has been extended so far that it encompasses things no well-fed person would ever consider. The siege of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 CE, described by the historian Josephus in his Jewish War, provides one of the most detailed and disturbing accounts of famine eating in the ancient world. The city was surrounded, its food supplies exhausted, and the population driven to consuming leather, straw, hay, and finally, according to Josephus, each other. His account of a woman named Mary who killed, roasted, and ate her own infant during the siege is one of the most famous and most disputed famine accounts in ancient literature. Whether this specific incident occurred exactly as described or represents the kind of extreme anecdote ancient historians deployed to convey the absolute limit of human suffering. The archaeological and historical record of the siege makes clear that the population experienced starvation of catastrophic severity, an extended period. The medieval city under prolonged siege consumed its resources in a predictable order that historians have been able to reconstruct from accounts of multiple sieges across different periods. Stored grain was consumed first, followed by animals, horses, dogs, dots, and rats in roughly that order. When animals were exhausted, people turned to leather, which could be boiled into a softened mass that provided some minimal caloric value. Candle waxes, dried herbs, boots, saddles, and harness. Anything with organic content followed. The progression was not merely anecdotal. Accounts of the siege of Antioch during the First Crusade in 97 to 98. The siege of Paris by the Normans in 885-8886. And numerous other medieval sieges all describe similar sequences, confirming that what looks in individual accounts like extreme anecdote actually represents a predictable behavioral pattern under extreme food deprivation. Rat meat, consumed in many sieges as a transitional protein source between larger animals and complete protein starvation, was expensive by the end of most prolonged sieges. The commodity had become so rare that the market price reflected genuine scarcity. During the siege of Paris in the Franco-Prussian War of 71 to 71, the zoological gardens were ultimately emptied for food. Elephants, camels, bears, and exotic animals that Parisians had visited for pleasure were slaughtered and served in restaurants that advertised the novelty of the menu. Restaurant menus from December 18 to 70 survived, showing dishes made from elephant, wolf, cat, and rat. The prices were extraordinary, reflecting both genuine scarcity and the perverse premium that novelty and desperation placed on the unusual. The Great Famine of Ireland between 845 and 852, in which approximately 1 million people died and another million emigrated, produced famine eating patterns documented by relief workers, officials, and survivors with sufficient detail to reconstruct the sequence of dietary desperation. The Irish rural poor whose diet had become dangerously dependent on a single crop, the potato, found themselves without food when the blight destroyed successive harvests. They ate nettles, weeds, wild grasses, and tree bark. They killed and consumed horses and donkeys. There are accounts of starving people eating grass from the fields and roadside, their mouths and fingers stained in green in a way that shocked observers. The consumption of raw shellfish from coastal areas produced outbreaks of disease that added to the mortality. In the most extreme cases, the bodies of those who had died of starvation were found with grass and nettles in their mouths and stomachs, tangible evidence, preserved in historical records, of what it means to die of hunger while surrounded by an environment offering nothing edible. The siege of Leningrad during World War II, which lasted from September 1942 to January 1944, 872 days, produced the most thoroughly documented eating of the modern era. The city of approximately 3 million people was cut off from supply lines, and the food ration for non-working civilians fell in November 1941 to 125 grams of bread per day. Bread that was adulterated with sawdust, cottonseed cake, and other non-food materials to increase its bulk. Leningraders consumed everything available. Wallpaper paste, which contained flour and potato starch. Leather belts and shoes boiled until soft enough to chew, petroleum jelly, lipstick, and eventually each other. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, documented over 1,000 cases of what they categorized as cannibalism during the siege, distinguishing in their records between corpse eating and the killing of others for food. Both occurred. The diaries of survivors described the psychological landscape of a city in which the smell of food had become unbearable, in which people dreamed only of eating, in which the moral framework that normally governed behavior under the most extreme pressure that human beings can endure. The Donner Party, the group of American settlers who became snowbound in the Sierra Nevada in the winter of 1846, 46, 47, has become the most famous cannibalism narrative in American history, partly because of the detailed documentation left by survivors and rescuers, and partly because it occurred within the context of the American westward expansion narrative, close enough to the present to feel immediate. Of the 87 people in the party, 48 survived. The survivors' accounts of consuming the flesh those who had died, carefully distinguished in the accounts from any killing of living people, are documented in letters, testimonies, and subsequent memoirs with an honesty that reflects both the genuine horror of the situation and the survivors' need to explain and justify decisions made under conditions of extreme desperation. Chapter 5. Olive and Wriggling. The history of eating living creatures in multiple cultures across history. The consumption of living animals, or at least animals still in some detectable state of biological activity at the moment of consumption, has been considered not repulsive but desirable, even prestigious. The reasons are various. Freshness guaranteed in an era before refrigeration, the demonstration of wealth through access to live luxury food, the belief that consuming living creatures transferred their vitality directly to the consumer, or simply the acquired taste of cultures that developed these practices cross generations. The ancient Romans prized oysters above almost any other food, and Roman oyster culture was extensive. oyster beds were maintained and cultivated in coastal areas, and oysters were transported across the empire packed in snow to preserve them. The Romans understood, as we do, that oysters should be consumed while still alive. A living oyster holds its shell closed, and an open, unresponsive oyster is a dead and potentially dangerous one. What is somewhat less familiar from the modern perspective is the scale of Roman oyster consumption. Archaeological excavations of sites across the empire reveal oyster shell deposits of extraordinary density. The writer Pliny recorded that the Roman gourmet Sarzosorata invented the first oyster farming operation in the late Republic, and the culture of competitive oyster consumption among the Roman elite was intense enough to be noted by multiple sources. The practice of consuming oysters, mussels, sea urchins, and other shellfish alive is continuous and widespread from ancient Rome to the present day. It becomes more specifically disturbing in the context of preparations designed to ensure that what is being consumed not merely technically alive, but demonstrably, visibly alive at the point of consumption. The Korean dish sanakshi, tentacles of freshly killed octopus still moving on the plate due to residual nerve activity, is frequently cited in Western accounts as an example of extreme eating. And it is genuinely the case that the moving tentacles present a sensory experience that many people find disturbing. But sanakji sits within a long tradition of preparations across many Asian cuisines in which the evidence of biological activity at the point of consumption is understood as a quality indicator rather than a source of revulsion. The historical practice of consuming live animals for perceived medical or vitality-conferring properties moved far beyond shellfish. In various periods of Chinese history, the practice of consuming bear bile, obtained either from captive bears through surgical implants or by killing the animal, was considered medicinally valuable. The practice of eating live baby mice in China, documented in historical sources and occasionally in contemporary contexts, was believed to confer health benefits. These practices reflect the ancient principle that consuming a living creature transfers its vital properties to the consumer, a principle that appeared in various forms across different medical and folk traditions. Early modern Europe had its own version of this logic. The consumption of live snails, whole, raw, in the shell, was recommended by physicians of the 16th and 17th centuries for respiratory ailments, on the grounds that the snail's mucus had properties beneficial to the lungs. The consumption of live earthworms, similarly prescribed for certain conditions, appears in medical texts of the period as a genuine recommendation rather than a folk remedy. The Italian practice of eating casumarzu, a sheep's milk cheese in which the presence of living maggots is considered an indicator of proper fermentation and a desirable quality of the final product, has a history stretching back centuries and continues in Sardinia to the present day, where it occupies a legal gray zone, having been banned under EU food hygiene regulations and then granted traditional food status by regional authorities. The annual tradition in some parts of England and continental Europe of eating live eels, purchased alive, killed immediately before cooking, and sometimes partially consumed while still in the process of expiration, reflects a practical approach to freshness that persisted long after refrigeration made it technically unnecessary. London's jellied eel tradition, now largely vanished from the city's food culture, involved eels purchased live from barrel keepers in street markets and taken home for preparation. The eel's nervous system is sufficiently autonomous that eels continue to move for a significant period after her apparent death, and accounts of the preparation process, particularly the skinning of still-moving eels, are not for the faint-hearted. Perhaps the most extreme historical practice in this category is the eeling, a small migratory songbird consumed in France under circumstances designed to be both physically and morally extreme. Ortolans were captured alive using traditional traps, blinded to prevent distress, fattened on millet and figs in dark cages until they had doubled in weight, then drowned in Armagnac brandy. The bird was then roasted whole and consumed in a single act. The entire bird, bones and all, in the mouth, with diners traditionally covering their heads with a large white napkin. The stated reason being to preserve the aromas, though the covering of the face also served to conceal what was being done from God. According to one tradition, the entire bird, beak to tail, was chewed and consumed, the bones crunching and the organs releasing their flavors. The practice was banned in France in 1999 under bird protection legislation, but it had continued to that point as an underground luxury. Chapter 6. Putrefaction as Delicacy. Fermiade, aged, and gide de deliberate rotted foods. The line between fermentation and putrefaction is, from a microbiological perspective, largely a matter of which organisms are doing the work and which byproducts they produce. Fermentation, controlled by specific bacteria or fungi under specific conditions, produces food that is both safe and, according to those who have developed a taste for it, delicious. Putrefaction, the action of a broader range of organisms under less controlled conditions, produces food that may be dangerous, and that produces sensory experiences, particularly olfactory ones, that many people find actively unbearable. The problem is that the distinction between these two processes, while real, is not always clean. Any of history's most prized fermented foods exist very close to the boundary. Hawk coral, fermented Greenlandic shark, the traditional Icelandic dish made from Greenland or basking shark, is perhaps the most frequently cited example of a deliberately fermented food that strikes nearly everyone outside its culture of origin as essentially indistinguishable from something dangerously putrid. The process is extensive and counterintuitive. Greenland shark flesh is naturally toxic when fresh, containing high concentrations of trimethylamine oxide and urea that make it poisonous without processing. To render it safe and edible, the shark is traditionally buried in gravel or sand for several months, during which the flesh undergoes a process of autolysis and fermentation breaks down the toxic compounds. The shark is then hung to dry for several additional months. The resulting product has an ammonia content so high that it burns the nose on consumption, and its flavor has been described by observers including Anthony Bourdain, not normally a man given to squeamishness, as the worst thing he had ever eaten. The history of cheese, from one perspective. The history of controlled and deliberate rotting of animal milk, the processes that produce the most extreme aged cheeses, the ammonia burn of very old Parmesan, the powerful earthiness of a perfectly ripe Ipuasus, the blue-green mold veins running through a Roquefort or Stilton, are the same biological processes directed by human intervention and tradition that would produce something completely inedible if allowed to proceed without that guidance. The casu marzu already mentioned, in which cheese is consumed with live maggots, represents the point at which the process has been extended beyond what even most cheese cultures consider acceptable. But it sits on a continuum with many other aged cheeses, rather than being categorically different from them. Surströmming, fermented Baltic herring from Sweden, one of the few foods to have been banned in multiple European countries, not because of safety concerns, but because of the smell. The fermentation process, which continues inside the sealed can and produces gases sufficient to make cans bulge, releases sulfur compounds of such a intensity that opening oaken outdoors is considered the only acceptable approach. And several apartment buildings in Germany and the United Kingdom have reportedly forbidden it on their premises. The smell, described by those who have encountered it as something between rotting fish, sewage, and sulfurous gas, is considered by its devoted consumers to be entirely separate from the taste, which they describe as complex, salty, and rewarding. The gap between the olfactory experience and the reported gustatory one is precisely what makes Hıstory so useful as an illustration of the gap between cultural conditioning and biological reaction. In medieval and early modern Europe, the preservation of meat before refrigeration required techniques that, when the conditions were not perfectly managed, produced results that modern food safety standards would classify without hesitation as dangerously spoiled. Salting, smoking, and drying, the primary preservation techniques, were not always sufficient, and the European medieval and early modern diet, particularly in winter and among those who could not afford to slaughter animals continuously, regularly included meat that was in various stages of deterioration. The solution was spice, the expensive, enormously valuable spices of the medieval spice trade, which served partly as flavoring agents and partly as masking agents for flavors that would otherwise make food unacceptable. The theory, sometimes repeated in popular history, that medieval people used spice primarily to disguise the taste of rotten meat, has been challenged by historians who point out that people who could afford expensive spices could also afford fresher meat. But the regular presence of spice in medieval recipes for cured meats and aged products does suggest at minimum that the baseline level of decomposition in preserved protein was significantly higher than what modern consumers would tolerate. The Chinese tradition of century eggs, duck, or quail eggs preserved for weeks to months in a mixture of clay, ash, salt, quicklime, and rice hulls produces a result that is simultaneously genuinely ancient as a culinary tradition and genuinely shocking to those who encounter it without preparation. The alkaline preservation process transforms the egg white into a dark, translucent, jelly-like substance with a strong ammonia smell, while the yolk becomes a dark greenish-gray with a creamy texture and a powerful sulfurous flavor. The history of century eggs appears to go back at least to the Ming Dynasty, and the dish remains a genuine cultural institution in Chinese cuisine, consumed regularly rather than as a novelty. The sensory experience of a century egg for someone outside the cultural tradition that produced it encapsulates precisely the challenge of distinguishing disgust rooted in genuine biological risk from disgust rooted purely in cultural unfamiliarity. Chapter 7. The Golden Table's Dark Side. Grotesque excess in royal and aristocratic courts throughout history. The tables of kings and emperors have been the sites of culinary competition, not merely for pleasure, but as demonstration of power, wealth, sophistication, and the ability to command extraordinary resources from across the known world. The display of excess was itself a political act, a performance of dominance, and yet the pursuit of culinary extreme for its own sake. The deliberate consumption of things chosen for their rarity, their costliness, or their capacity to shock, repeatedly crossed into territory that even contemporaries found disturbing. The court of the French kings at Versailles under Louis XIV represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of aristocratic eating excess in European history. The Sun King's meals were public performance. He ate alone at a formal table by hundreds of courtiers and officials who observed the ritual of the royal meal with the solemnity of a religious ceremony. The quantities consumed were extraordinary by modern standards, and contemporary accounts describe Louis consuming multiple servings of soup, entire birds, enormous quantities of salad, plates of mutton, ham, and hard-boiled eggs, followed by pastries, fruit, and confections, all in a single sitting, observed by a respectful audience. The king's physician recorded his meals with meticulous detail out of medical concern, as Louis suffered from intestinal disorders throughout his life that were undoubtedly related to the volume and richness of his diet. The English King Henry VIII, who has become the popular image of the glutton monarch, consumed meals of documented excess. Archaeological analysis of skeletal remains and contemporary accounts paint a picture of a man whose eating habits contributed substantially to the health problems that defined his later reign. The food of the Tudor court at its most extravagant included preparations that seem bizarre by modern standards. Whole peacocks roasted and then redressed in their own feathers for presentation. Elaborate sugar sculptures, subtleties, representing castles, ships, and heraldic animals that were consumed after serving as table decoration, and quantities of roasted meats that the largest households produced in industrial quantities in great kitchens that operated continuously. The banquets of the Renaissance Italian nobility introduced a competitive element to extreme eating that combined culinary with theatrical ambition. The intermezzo, entertainment between courses, could last longer than the eating itself, and the boundary between the edible and the decorative was deliberately blurred. Pies containing live birds, which flew out when the crust was cut, were a famous set piece. Less frequently mentioned was the aftermath. The live birds flying around a closed banqueting hall, panicking, defecating on the guests and the food, and eventually being caught or dying against the windows. The theatrical impact justified, for those who organized such spectacles, the practical inconvenience. The Mughal emperors of India consumed meals of documented extravagance that drew on a culinary tradition of extraordinary sophistication. But at the extreme end of imperial eating, the Mughal court produced preparations whose excess reflected the absolute power of the emperor over every resource of a subcontinent. The biryani and korma traditions that have survived into modern South Asian cuisine represent the more accessible face of Mughal court cooking. But historical accounts of the most lavish imperial banquets describe dishes requiring ingredients gathered from across Central Asia, Persia, and the Indian subcontinent, cooked in quantities that fed hundreds and prepared by kitchen staffs numbering in the thousands. The phenomenon of professional competitive eating, individuals consuming extraordinary quantities of a single food in a competitive context, has a longer history than its contemporary carnival association might suggest. Medieval European fairs and festivals included eating competitions. The tradition of challenge eating at inns and taverns, who could consume a quantity of food beyond normal human capacity, is documented across multiple European cultures. What changes in the modern era is not the phenomenon itself, but the scale of its commercialization and the medical understanding of what such consumption does to the human body. Contemporary research on competitive eating has documented the extraordinary physiological adaptations and the genuine health risks involved in training to consume enormous quantities of food rapidly. The stomach of a trained competitive eater, documented by radiological imaging during competition, stretches to a volume several times that of an untrained person and behaves in ways that gastroenterologists find deeply counterintuitive. Chapter 8. Eating the Sacred and the Forbidden. Ritual conscience, across the distinction between food and non-food, is never purely biological. It is always also cultural, religious, and moral, a set of collectively maintained boundaries that define what a community is and is not by what it will and will not put in its mouths. The most powerful of these boundaries are those maintained by religious tradition, and the history of ritual eating and ritual food prohibition is a history of extraordinary complexity, including, at the extremes, the sanctified consumption of things that ordinary taboo would absolutely forbid, the ritual consumption of human flesh, cannibalism, in religious or ceremonial contexts, has been documented in enough cultures across enough historical periods, it can't not be dismissed as marginal. The Aztec practice of ritual cannibalism following human sacrifice is the most frequently cited example in popular history. And it is genuine. Documentally in Spainly inch colonial accounts were written by people with substantial reasons to portray the Aztecs in the most negative terms possible, but also in pre-contact indigenous pictographic manuscripts and in the archaeological record, which shows patterns of cut marks on human bones consistent with defleshing for consumption. The scale of Aztec ritual sacrifice and the associated cannibalism remains a subject of ongoing historical debate, with estimates of the number of sacrifices ranging from a few hundred to tens of thousands per year. The religious interpretation of the practice matters enormously for understanding what was actually happening. Within Aztec cosmological beliefs, the universe required regular infusions of human blood to maintain its operation. The sun itself was sustained by sacrifice. To consume the flesh of a sacrificed person, not merely permitted, but part of a cosmic transaction. The human body as medium of communication and sustenance of divine powers. Warriors who died in battle or on the sacrificial stone were not victims in the Aztec understanding, but honored participants in the maintenance of cosmic order. This does not make the practice less disturbing from a modern perspective, but it makes the popular framing of Aztec cannibalism as straightforward savagery substantially inadequate as his historical explanation. The Kuru epidemic that devastated the four people of Papua New Guinea in the mid-20th century provides one of the most disturbing intersections of ritual eating and disease in modern history. Kuru, a prion disease related to Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, was transmitted among the four through the practice of ritualized mortuary cannibalism, in which the deceased consumed by their kin as an act of mourning and respect. The brain, which carries the highest concentration of infectious prion proteins, was consumed along with other organs. Women and children, who participated more extensively in these rituals, were affected at higher rates than adult men. By the time Western medical researchers, including D. Carleton Gajdusek, who received the notice of the Nobel Prize Kuru in 1976, established the connection between the ritual eating practices and the epidemic, the disease had killed thousands of four people. The cessation of the cannibalistic practices led to the gradual disappearance of new Kuru cases. Though the disease's long incubation period meant cases continued to appear for decades afterward, the history of religious food prohibition is in many ways the mirror image of ritual consumption. The marking of identity and the maintenance of community through the refusal to eat rather than through the act of eating. Jewish kashrut law, Islamic halal requirements, Hindu vegetarianism, and the various food restrictions of Buddhism all define communities, in part, through what they will not eat. The violation of these prohibitions has been, throughout history, both a source of profound communal distress and a tool of persecution. Forcing conquered or subjugated populations to eat forbidden foods as an act of humiliation and cultural destruction. The practices of early Christian communities around the Eucharist, the ritual, the consumption of bread and wine understood, in Catholic theology, to be transformed into the actual body and blood of Christ, generated accusations of cannibalism from Roman critics who misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented what was happening in Christian worship. These accusations, which circulated in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, reflect the power of the category of cannibalism as accusation and the extent to which ritual eating practices, even when the substance consumed is bread and wine, can be understood from the outside as transgressive or threatening. The theological concept of transubstantiation, developed in the medieval period to explain precisely what happens during the Eucharist, represents one of the most sophisticated theological responses to this persistent accusation in the history of religious thought. Chapter 9, The Industry of Adulteration. What was really in the food, the history of food adulteration, the deliberate addition of cheaper, inferior, or dangerous substances to food products for commercial advantage, is as long as the history of food commerce itself. Wherever food is bought and sold by people who do not know each other personally and cannot verify the quality of what they are purchasing, the temptation and opportunity to defraud exists. And throughout most of human history, the scientific tools to detect adulteration, the regulatory infrastructure to prevent it, and the legal mechanisms to punish it were either absent or grossly insufficient. The Roman market was extensively regulated. The evidence of price edicts, market supervisors called ediles, and numerous legal texts addressing food fraud. Regulation did not prevent widespread adulteration. Wine was one of the most heavily adulterated commodities. The addition of seawater to wine, which increased its volume while preserving it, was practiced widely enough to be mentioned in multiple sources. Lead was used both in the form of lead vessels used to store and sweeten wine. The sweet taste of lead acetate made it an attractive additive, and in the form of deliberate adulteration. The consumption of lead-sweetened wine among the Roman elite almost certainly contributed to lead poisoning on a significant scale, and some historians have argued that chronic lead exposure among the Roman upper classes contributed to the reproductive failures and neurological symptoms that are documented among the elite. Was new, but because industrialization, urbanization, and the increasingly anonymous nature of urban food markets created conditions in which adulteration could occur on an industrial scale, largely invisible to the consumers affected. The investigations of the chemist Friedrich Occam, published in 2020 in his book A Treatise on Adulterations of Food and Culinary Poisons, and the subsequent work of Arthur Hassall, who published the results of systematic microscopic analysis of common foods in The Lancet in the early 1850s, revealed a food supply of extraordinary contamination. Hassall's analysis found almost nothing was as it purported to be. Coffee was routinely diluted with chicory, roasted grain, and ground acorns. Tea was extended with dried leaves of various other plants, sometimes including exhausted tea leaves that had been dried and resold. Bread contained chalk, alum, and other additives is used to whiten the flour and increase the volume of the loaf. Pepper was adulterated with ground floor sweepings and other vegetable matter. Cayenne pepper contained red lead oxide, which gave it color and bulk. Pickles were dyed green with copper sulfate, a toxic substance, to give them the vivid color that consumers expected. Confectionery, particularly the brightly colored sweets sold to children, contained chromate of lead for yellow coloring, vermilion, a mercury compound, for red, and arsenite of copper for green. The casual poisoning of the Victorian population through its food supply was not the result of malice directed at any individual, but of a commercial food system in which the incentive to adulterate was high and the risk of detection or punishment was minimal. The American meatpacking industry at the turn of the 20th century has been described in such detail by Upton Sinclair in his Mind-Twentyneer's sixth novel, The Jungle, drawn from extensive investigative research, that it has defined public perception of industrial food production ever since. Sinclair documented a system in which diseased and injured animals were slaughtered without inspection, in which workers fell into rendering vats and were processed along with the animal fat and incorporated into lard and other products, in which meat that had begun to decompose was treated with chemical preservatives and sold as fresh. The accuracy of specific details in Sinclair's account has been debated by historians, but the general picture of an industry operating with minimal oversight, producing products of genuinely dangerous quality, is supported by independent historical evidence and by the legislative response that Sinclair's book provoked, including the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1916, the melamine contamination of Chinese infant formula and other food products in 2008 represent the contemporary phase of food adulteration. industrialized, systematic, and ultimately responsible for the deaths of at least 6 infants and the serious illness of thousands more. Melamine, an industrial chemical, was deliberately added to infant formula and other dairy products to artificially inflate the apparent protein content when tested by standard nitrogen-based assays, allowing manufacturers to dilute their products with water while appearing to meet nutritional standards. The incident, when it became public, had consequences reaching across the global food supply. Chinese dairy products were recalled from markets in multiple countries, and the revelation that systematic adulteration had been occurring at industrial scale in a major food exporting nation prompted a significant reassessment of international food safety oversight. Chapter 10: Eating in the Dark, Prison, Poverty, and the Diet of Desperation for the majority of people throughout most of human history. The question of what to eat was not a matter of preference or pleasure, but of what was available, what could be afforded, and what would sustain life. The diet of the poor across different historical periods was constrained by circumstances of such severity that the modern concept of food preference seems almost frivolous in this context, and the diet imposed on prisoners by institutions whose interest in keeping inmates alive was at best secondary to other institutional priorities could descend to levels of deliberate deprivation that constitute a form of punishment through food as devastating in its effects as any physical punishment. The bread eaten by the very poor in medieval Europe was a product very different from anything that the word bread would conjure in modern imaginations, made from whatever grain was available: rye, barley, oats, and in the worst times, wheat mixed with ground, dried peas, beans, acorns, bark, and other plant cereals. It was durance, frequently sour from poor fermentation, sometimes containing ergot-infested grain that could cause convulsions and hallucinations, and often the product of grain that had been stored for extended periods, conditions that promoted mold growth. The bread that sustained the European peasantry was a food of remarkable resourcefulness and remarkable wretchedness simultaneously. Ergotism, poisoning by alkaloids produced by the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which infects rye and other grains, was a recurring catastrophe in medieval and early modern Europe that affected populations dependent on rye bread. The two forms of ergotism: gangrenous, which caused the extremities to dry up and fall away as blood supply was cut off, and convulsive, which caused muscle spasms, hallucinations, and seizures, were devastating and mysterious to people who had no understanding of their fungal cause. The condition was known as St. Anthony's fire, and sufferers traveled to the shrine of St. Anthony in France seeking miraculous cure, where they often improved, not because of miraculous intervention, because the shrine's food stores contained ergot-free wheat rather than the contaminated rye they had been eating at home. Some historians have proposed that outbreaks of mass hysterical behavior in medieval and early modern communities, including the dancing plagues of the 14th and 15th centuries and possibly the Salem witch trials of 1692, were related to ergot contamination of the local grain supply, though this hypothesis remains contested. The diet of incarcerated people throughout most of the history of imprisonment was designed primarily to sustain life at the minimum possible cost, with little attention to nutrition and none to palatability. The workhouse diet in Victorian England, established by the Poor Law Commissioners with the explicit intention of making inking indoor relief. The workhouse, less attractive than any conceivable alternative, consisted primarily of gruel, a thin porridge of oatmeal or cornmeal in water, bread, occasional small quantities of meat or cheese. The gruel of the Victorian workhouse, not merely unpleasant. Analysis of workhouse diets has shown them to be nutritionally inadequate, producing the stunted growth and immune deficiencies that characterize populations of chronic poverty. The American practice of chain gangs convict prisoners performing hard labor in chain gangs on public roads and roads throughout the American South, the post-Civil War period through the mid-20th century, was accompanied by a feeding regime designed to sustain maximum physical labor, output at minimum cost. Chain gang food, documented by investigators and former prisoners in accounts spanning from the 1880s to the 1950s, consisted primarily of cornbread, dried peas and beans, and salt pork or other cheap preserved meat, with occasional vegetables. Inadequate caloric content for the work demanded, combined with heat, physical punishment, and the absence of any medical care, produced mortality rates in some chain gang operations that exceeded those of plantation slavery. The Japanese prisoner of war camps of World War II imposed starvation diets on Allied prisoners that, combined with forced labor, tropical disease, and physical abuse, produced mortality rates of approximately 27% among Western prisoners, a figure that compares to approximately 4% mortality among Western prisoners held by Germany and Italy. The diet in many Japanese PO camps consisted of small quantities of rice, sometimes augmented with whatever plant material prisoners could food forage, and occasional additions of meat so small and of such poor quality that they were arguably worse nutritional value than their absence. Survivors of camps in Southeast Asia describe a progressive deterioration in which the will and capacity additional food, insects, plant material of any kind, became one of the primary distinctions between those who survived and those who did not. Chapter 11. The Pharmacopoeia of Horror, Medicines e Intentro, the AIDS, the history of what human beings have consumed in the name of health, on the advice of qualified physicians, within the framework of the best medical knowledge of their time, is one of the most vertiginous in the entire catalog of human eating practices. The fact that these consumptions occurred in a medical rather than a culinary context does not diminish their impact. In many cases, it intensifies it, because the people who ate these things did so not from pleasure, desperation, or cultural tradition, but from trust in authorities who were guiding them, however misguided those authorities' beliefs ultimately proved, toward health and survival. The practice of drinking blood as medicine extended far beyond the gladiatorial arena described in an earlier chapter. Throughout the medieval and early modern period, human blood in various preparations appeared regularly in medical prescriptions. Dried and powdered blood was sold in pharmacies. Blood from young, healthy people, specifically characterized in medical literature as more potent than blood from the elderly, was particularly valued. The concept of medical vampirism, as it has been called by some historians, was not a folk superstition confined to rural populations. It appears in the published works of trained physicians and the official pharmacopoeias of major European states. The Paracelsian alchemical tradition, which dominated European medical innovation in the 16th century and continued to influence medical practice well into the 17th, generated a pharmacopoeia of extraordinary ambition and considerable danger. Paracelsus and his followers prescribed preparations containing mercury, antimony, arsenic, and lead, substances that are straightforwardly toxic, on the basis of theories about their action on the body that were internally coherent within the alchemical framework, but entirely wrong in their understanding of physiology and toxicology. Mercury treatment for syphilis, rubbed to the skin or taken internally, persisted as mainstream medical practice from the early 16th century until the early 20th, partly because syphilis produces periods of remission, during which the patient improves regardless of treatment, creating the illusion that the mercury was working. The practice of eating earth, geophagy, appears across multiple cultures and historical periods in contexts, ranging from religious ritual to poverty food to deliberate medical therapy. Certain clays have genuine binding properties that can reduce the symptoms of diarrhea and intestinal distress, and indigenous knowledge of which specific clays were beneficial was sometimes accurate in ways that preceded Western scientific understanding. The widespread geophagy documented among enslaved people in the American South was partially explained by nutritional deficiency, specifically iron deficiency, and partially by cultural practices brought from West Africa. Physicians' responses to geophagy among enslaved people, which included the use of iron face masks to prevent it, represent one of the more disturbing intersections of medical practice and racial control in American history. The sovereign remedy, a catch-all preparation sold by itinerant medicine men and patent medicine manufacturers from the early modern period to the late 19th century, typically contained any combination of alcohol, opium derivatives, cocaine, and various plant extracts, sometimes supplemented with mercury, arsenic, strychnine in small doses that were understood to have tonic properties. The Victorian and Edwardian patent medicine market produced products of breathtaking pharmacological or recklessness. Soothing syrups for teething infants that contained morphine, tonics for tired women that contained significant quantities of cocaine, liver pills that contained mercury. These products were consumed in enormous quantities by populations who had no way to know what was in them, and who frequently experienced genuine short-term relief from the opiates and stimulants, which reinforced their faith in the preparation's efficacy. The early history of organ transplantation medicine in the decades before blood typing and immunological understanding made successful transplantation possible, produced a period of medical experimentation. Viewed from the present, has a distinctly grotesque quality. The work of John Brinkley in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s, the transplantation of goat testicles into human patients for the alleged treatment of impotence and general vitality decline, was eventually recognized as fraudulent. But in the context of a period in which rejuvenation therapy using animal glands was a serious subject of mainstream medical research, the experiments of Serge Voronov in France, involving the transplantation of chimpanzee testicular tissue into aging human patients, were published in respectable medical journals, and attracted international attention. Brinkley's enterprise represented the popular medicine fringe of a mainstream medical preoccupation with glandular therapy. Chapter 12. The contemporary tableau's darkest corners. Modern extremes, the modern food system, with its extraordinary abundance, its global supply chains, its food safety regulations, and its nutritional science, might seem to have left behind the worst extremes of historical eating practice, and in many respects it has. The spontaneous mass poisoning of urban populations by adulterated, the famine diets of siege and catastrophe, the medical prescriptions of powdered human skull and undered fat. These are gone from the lives of most people in wealthy countries. But the contemporary world has produced its own extremes, some driven by the same forces: desperation, excess, belief, commerce, that drove the historical practices we have examined. The industrialized factory farming system that produces the majority of the world's meat, particularly chicken and eggs, subjects animals to conditions of such systematic discomfort and physiological abnormality that its practices, if described without the familiarity that market scale confers, would strike most people as profoundly disturbing. Broiler chickens bred for maximum muscle mass in minimum time develop legs too weak to support their body weight for more than a few steps. They spend their brief lives in densely packed sheds, unable to engage in most of the behaviors that characterize the species. Layer hens spend their laying lives in cages too small to spread their wings. Factory farm pigs are housed in conditions of intense crowding that produce stress behaviors. Biting, aggression, that are managed by routine tail docking. These practices are legal, widespread, and represent the food system choices of an industrial society that has prioritized price and volume over animal welfare. They are, by any pre-industrial standard of how farm animals were kept, extreme. The global bushmeat trade, the hunting, slaughter, and consumption of wild animals, including primates, bats, pangolins, and other wildlife, has attracted attention in recent decades primarily through its documented role in the transmission of zoonotic diseases to human populations, including Ebola, HIV, SARS, and possibly COVID-19. But beyond the epidemiological concern, the bushmeat trade presents a genuine intersection of cultural tradition, poverty, and conservation emergency. In parts of Central and West Africa, the consumption of primate species, including species closely related to humans, is embedded in food cultures that predate conservation concern. The fact that this consumption may drive these species toward extinction adds a dimension to the bushmeat story that no other category of extreme eating quite matches. The competitive eating circuit. Competitive eating as organized sport with formal competitions, professional athletes, and commercial sponsorship produces food consumption events that, viewed through the lens of this documentary's subject matter, belong in this catalog. The Nathan's famous hot dog eating contest at Coney Island, which has attracted competitors capable of consuming more than 70 hot dogs in 10 minutes, is the best known but far from the only example. The physiological reality of competitive eating training, the deliberate stretching of the stomach through regular consumption of very large volumes of food, the development of the ability to suppress the gag reflex, the management of jaw fatigue, intersects with documented long-term health consequences that gastroenterologists are only beginning to characterize systematically. The rise of extreme food tourism, travel specifically to consume foods that would be unavailable, illegal, culturally inaccessible in the traveler's home country, reflects the contemporary appetite for novelty and transgression that has always characterized the extreme end of human eating behavior. The consumption of highly endangered shark fin, bear bile, sea turtle eggs, and other protected species by food tourists represents a market with documented effects on conservation. The demand for raw dog meat, monkey brains, other preparations that exist at the edges of their own culture's food norms, consumed by outsiders specifically for their transgressive quality, raises questions about the ethics of food tourism that have no easy answers. The history of human eating at extremes, ultimately a history of human nature in all its dimensions, its capacity for survival, for cultural creativity, for superstition, for cruelty, for excess, for the construction of elaborate belief systems that justify the otherwise unjustifiable. Food, the most fundamental of human necessities, has never been only about sustenance. It has always also been about identity, power, belief, transgression, and the endless human drive to push against whatever limits present themselves. The things people have eaten throughout history, the substances they have consumed, the rituals they have performed, the boundaries they have crossed, tell us as much about what it means to be human as the art they have made or the cities they have built. Perhaps more, because food is where the animal and the cultural meet most nakedly, and the history of eating is the history of that meeting, in all its complexity, its ingenuity, and its darkness.